For more on this, we're joined by Phyllis Bennis. She's the author of Understanding the Palestinian-Israeli Conflict, a primer. She directs the new Internationalism Project at the Institute for Policy Studies right here in Washington, D.C. Break it down for us. Why is this important, or is it important?
I think it is important. It's not important because it's going to change something on the ground. Whether or not there are embassy buildings created, that's not what's important. What's important is this is an end of the U.S.-European collaboration. This is really a message more to Washington than it is to Tel Aviv. This is telling Washington that it can no longer assume that all of the Western European countries, all of the European countries, are going to automatically follow its lead in allowing U.S. control of these failed peace talks that have been going on now for 23 years. This is potentially the beginning of a new European position.
And how does it shift things then? Is Washington going to get the message? Is Israel going to get the message? I mean, how does this message translate?
Yeah. Well, this is a difficult thing. In Israel, we're looking at a situation where the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, who's known as a very right-wing figure, is actually very much a centrist in the context of his cabinet, because the government has moved so far to the right that he, by standing still, is basically at the center. So he's needing to placate his much further right wing. And many in that right wing have said, you know what, we don't need a two-state solution. We're better off with the status quo, which is essentially a one-state solution that is an apartheid state. It's one government in control of the entire territory, but with different legal systems for the different populations, something that's completely unacceptable in terms of international law. And as long as the focus is on the issue of rights, that's going to be a much more difficult thing for European governments to challenge their own people, where 65% of Europeans are saying, we want Europe to recognize a Palestinian state. And that's kind of shorthand for, we want to support rights for the Palestinians. The big question, as you ask, what will the U.S. do? The U.S. is going to be not happy about this, but this is one more piece in the puzzle that says that the U.S. policy that we've seen over these last 23 years that have failed as long as they've been going on, failed to bring peace, failed to bring justice, failed to bring security for Israelis or rights for Palestinians, none of that is going to work. And if Europe stops going along with the U.S. leadership, there could be a very different scenario where the United Nations becomes central rather than Washington, where other countries other than the U.S. move to take the initiative. Now, as long as the U.S. continues its current policy towards Israel, providing $3.2 billion a year in military aid and providing absolute impunity in the United Nations, the immediate response to the European move will not be enormous. But it's the beginning. It's not just a slippery slope. It's already halfway down that slope. So this is, I think, a very important move.
You brought up the UN, and Secretary General Ban Ki-moon at a forum not too long ago said that basically, I'm kind of paraphrasing, but the insanity has to end. These bombings, then moving the materials back in, rebuilding, bombings, rebuilding, and you and I have had this conversation as well. Right. We saw what happened in Sweden, and it seems as though there's some type of domino effect going underway. Britain, Spain, France. Do the dominoes continue to fall? Does that put more and more pressure on the United States and Israel maybe to change the calculus in some way?
I think it does. When France makes this judgment, that's very, very important. You know, when it's only maybe Greece and Spain, the U.S. can dismiss that and say, well, it's a couple of countries on the periphery. We don't have to pay too much attention. But when you have major countries, now the big issue will be Germany. The German chancellor has indicated that she would not support this kind of a move. But there is an increasing move inside Germany to say, we have to look at things differently. It's not enough anymore to say that we were responsible for the Holocaust and therefore we must support anything that Israel does. That's no longer an operative view in Germany, particularly among younger people.
I want to give you get your thoughts on one last thing before we head on. This is a passage from the New York Times, and it says, quote, this issue is particularly delicate in France, which has the largest Muslim and Jewish populations in Europe. The war in Gaza last summer set off violent protests in several French cities. So do you think that this has the potential, though, to open up, reopen some of these wounds there in France, perhaps?
Well, I think that's possible, but I also think what we need to understand is that just like in the United States, public opinion among Jewish communities in Europe, particularly in France, have changed dramatically. You're seeing massive levels of support from French Jews, as you are from American Jews, for demands to end the occupation, support for the movement, what's known as BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, to bring nonviolent economic pressure to bear on Israel. And the key to it is that the focus now is on human rights. It's not on, we want one state, two state, red state, blue state. It's not on states. It's about rights. It's about equality. It's about the right to return. It's about ending the apartheid system that now exists. And that is bringing in huge numbers, particularly of young Jews. So I think that the notion that any shift in policy towards Israel will necessarily lead to a clash between Muslims on the one hand and Jews on the other among French, or among Americans for that matter, is simply not the case anymore. There's been too big a shift in that discourse.
Phyllis Bennis, always a pleasure having you in. Thanks so much for stopping by.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.